All right. So when we left off in class, we were starting to talk about joining the war. We had talked about things that got us into the war, among them Germans' invasion of innocent and neutral Belgium, um, the Zimmerman Note, the sinking of the Lusitania. So all these things ended up uh, putting us into the war to, as Wilson called it, keep democracy safe. Okay. All right. So now we're going to be talking about within the United States, how does our government create a unified war effort? And the first one has to do with our factories. So the government created a war industries board that would identify and connect with different industries that it needed to retool their factories so that they would be able to purchase stuff and have things made for the war effort. And so, factories to retool to make uniforms or guns or bullets or supplies or whatever that the military needed. And these companies, they wanted to do it because that's a guaranteed buyer for them. And so, really, in a way, for certain industries, our factories kind of went communist. The government's setting the prices, the government's paying for it. There's their main buyer, and so that's what we did. Now, not all industries were part of this, just only the ones that were identified. If they were non-essential, then they really had no interaction with the War Industries Board. But if they made something that was useful to the military, then the government was working pretty closely with them to supply that. Okay, another group that the government created during this time was a group to kind of make sure that everybody was had a positive view of the war, that they had a common sense of the German Hun was the enemy, and that everybody was kind of on the same team. And so, to that end, they created the Committee on Public Information, and more or less, it was a propaganda, uh, group. They would send out what they called 4-minute men, which they'd go to your door and they'd give kind of a quick speech about what's going on and why Germany's the bad guy. And they put out propaganda posters. They, try to get people to uh, save, certain types of foods and certain types of materials that could be used then for the war effort. They encouraged people on the radio to follow along where the military was going in Europe and on maps, and it just kind of got people interested in and kind of focused on the Allied side against the Germans. Now, kind of working in concert with the Committee on Public Information was U.S. Food Administration, headed by a guy named Herbert Hoover, who we're going to see later in the 20s as one of our U.S. presidents. But to make sure that our military was fed, the government asked people to kind of sacrifice certain things. And so you can see here, this is a propaganda poster. So save a loaf a week, help win the war, from the U.S. Food Administration. And they would do things like meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. Since a lot of German food was in America, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty cabbage, and a hot dog was was a Liberty sausage instead of a Frankfurter or a hot dog. And this way, it just kind of galvanized the U.S. effort, even by people at home, not close to the fighting. All right, so all that's propaganda. Really, we're going to see propaganda used initially in World War I, but we're going to see it used especially in World War II. But propaganda, if hopefully you understand by this point, propaganda is just any kind of information that's used to, we could say manipulate, but try to galvanize public opinion towards a certain view. And that's what our government tried to do during this time, because there were a lot of people that were against the war. Typically, progressives were against the war. Socialists were against the war. So there were a number of groups that were against the war. Midwestern farmers tended to be against the war. So yeah, there there was some dissension within the United States. Not everybody was coalesced to the war effort. And really, to make sure that people didn't speak out against the war too much, we had a kind of controversial set of laws that were passed, the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And I think really the main thing you need to understand is for espionage, that means that you cannot be spying or giving away government secrets or things like that. But the Sedition Act was the thing that was more impactful to protest groups. Obviously, Eugene V. Debs gets thrown into jail protesting the war. So it just became illegal to speak out against the government. And we kind of think of that as a very foreign idea because that's something that, America does all the time. But in Schenck versus United States, the Supreme Court ruled that in a time of war and a kind of a time of emergency, the government is allowed to take kind of extra legal matters, and they can make laws that restrict your liberties during those times of emergency. And that's kind of an important one that still kind of goes today. All right. One of the biggest things that our government did to try to create a unified effort and also try to be able to pay for the war itself was to issue out, basically liberty bonds. And so this became a way that you could help, even though you weren't going to ever hold a gun or fight in the war, you could do your part. And so buying a bond would help pay for the war, but also help you to do your part at home. All right. Now, the state of our military as we begun World War I was relatively small. We had never been a huge military country. And so we had to expand our military. And so the United States government worked to do that, to build up our military. And so as we kind of moved closer to going into the war, we created something called the National Defense Act of 1916, and that really expands our regular army, basically doubles it from about 90,000 to 180,000. And then we created a Selective Service Act, and this would help the government to basically identify people that were 18 to really about 40. And that way, if they needed to institute a draft, they could do that. And really, our government took the stance of work or fight. And so if you were going to work, great. If you were going to strike, then, which a lot of companies did during the time with wartime inflation, oftentimes wages didn't keep up with prices. And so our government took the stance of work or fight. And so, they did some other things where they, in the ones that the War Industries Board were trying to work with, they just flat out wouldn't allow. They would put anybody in jail that tried to strike. But if you were in a non-essential type of industry, then they just took the work or fight stance. All right. So the military was expanded. Our military at this time was that was going over to World War I to, kind of over there, as they say from the song, was called the American Expeditionary Force. And what the American Expeditionary Force is going to do is they're going to be able to give this kind of shot in the arm, or this revitalized spirit for Britain and France and, the Russians who are leaving, this kind of shot in the arm about, hey, we've been bogged down for almost 3 years of trench warfare. We're exhausted. And now the Americans are going to come in and they are going to kind of revitalize the war effort. Okay, so paying for the war. The war is paid for by 2/3, and I'll give you guys the time to write this down. I got to plug in my my computer. It's paid for by bonds for 2/3 of it, and then the other third of it was paid for by the new graduated income tax. Sorry about that. I had to plug in my computer. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about kind of some of the happenings or things that occur within the United States as the war is going on. Because remember, we are not really in the war for a long time, but the war does have significant effects, within the United States nonetheless during the war and after. And one of those huge impacts are the mass exodus of African Americans who leave during both wars, really. And so this flood is going to kind of continue beyond the dates that I have. This will happen as well in World War II. But you have this mass exodus for people that want to get free from sharecropping and prejudice and racism and poverty, and they find that there is a vacuum created by factory jobs and other jobs where men have gone to fight in the war. White males have gone to fight in the war, and these industries of whatever kind in the North, they need workers, and so people step in to fill that vacuum. You do have some women that come in and fight in the war, and we'll talk about that, or go to work during the war. And we do have some Hispanic people coming, mostly from Mexico, that are coming in to work in the agricultural fields of California. But we have literally, guys, hundreds of thousands of African Americans leaving the South in what is now called the Great Migration. So African Americans went up to cities today of Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and then of course, places like Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York City, Washington, D.C. So, these places, even still today, have these almost like chain migration populations, like the South Side Chicago, East St. Louis, North Philadelphia. These are all places with now historically Black populations, Brooklyn, Harlem. That this is when it started. It started during World War I for these people to get jobs. So that's a huge thing. And so, this does create race riots. We have race riots in, St. Louis. We have a race riot in Detroit. Probably the biggest one where 20 African Americans were killed were in 1919 in a Chicago race riot where, white hooligans were going through Black neighborhoods and literally just indiscriminately killing Black people as a result of Black people now coming up into these traditionally white areas. Now, during the war, African Americans did fight. There were several 100,000 that did fight in the war, but they did fight in segregated units. At this point, we don't have an integrated military, and we won't till really after World War II. Okay, what were their hopes for fighting? Well, their hopes for fighting was that they would show that they're good Americans and that they deserve to be treated equally. And of course, this really did not happen. Okay, women's roles. So obviously, women were in some of those traditional roles in nursing. The Red Cross. Women were key in fostering a good spirit of togetherness. But then we did see that women did start to work in war industries, as you can see on the picture on the left. Now, this will really pick up in World War II when there's a really tremendous shortage of work in the factories. But for right now, that's kind of beginning. But for the most part, women are doing those traditional support roles in terms of the war effort. All right, modern warfare. I think I kind of covered this in class. I'll go through this pretty quickly. But with industrial warfare, obviously things have changed. So you can't just sit out and stand in front of your opponent. You have to dig in for trenches, and trenches were just awful. They'd fill up with rain. They'd get rats. They'd stink. You just couldn't go anywhere, and it was a lot of times it's just very boring. The picture on the right, you can see as the result of chemical warfare. So mustard gas, phosphine gas, those were really scary. You can see early tanks, okay, repeating rifles or machine guns, and even planes. This is some of the new technology. And then, of course, probably the biggest ones I don't have on there are the big, howitzers and the mortars that would shoot, up to a quarter or half a mile. And those could do some pretty bad damage. So warfare had changed, and this is really a war where we see that. We'd kind of seen it in our American Civil War, but here we could really see it. All right. So when we enter the war in late kind of 1917, we enter into really now a one-front war. The Russians had left, and so the Eastern Front's kind of done. And so what we're really trying to do is make sure that that Paris is protected. You can kind of see that Paris is pretty close to where the Western Front was. And so when we kind of get to the war, there's the Somme offensive and the Second Battle of the Marne. And really, those are going to be decisive battles in pushing the Germans back. And that's really what we do. That's our main contribution, is that we give a revitalized spirit. We're able to hold the line and kind of push the Western Front back towards Germany. Okay. Oh, and another important thing that we need to understand is that between the U.S. and the British, but the U.S. Navy is largely responsible for going out there in the English Channel, especially, and laying a huge minefield. And those drastically cut down the German U-boat attacks as the U-boats started running into those minefields. This made it easier for Britain and France to get those U.S. supplies that they needed to turn the tide. So really kind of, we got two sides that are tired. The United States comes in and helps kind of turn the tide. All right. So the end of the war comes in November of 1918. Everybody's happy. Everybody's done. But what does it mean for the United States? Well, Woodrow Wilson really tried to become, even though the United States was only into the war for a year, he really tried to make the world safe for democracy. And so he tried to have a heavy hand in the peace negotiations. And the world powers were really not into that idea. They thought he was an idealist, this utopian dreamer. And so I think Wilson believed he was a little more important than he actually was. But he did come up with at least a good plan and theory that is kind of now known in history as his 14 points. And I don't think you need to spend a lot of time, going over what each of the 14 points were, but here's some of the highlights. One, that there'd be no more secret alliances. There'd be freedom of the seas. So, places like Gibraltar and the Strait of Malacca and places like that would cause trouble, those choke points, that they'd be open to everyone. And that countries couldn't control those things. And that would lessen the idea that we had, control or fight over those places. One, that we, instead of an arms race, instead of building up our military, that we, as a world would reduce armaments and reduce the size of our industrial militaries. And the countries of the world, especially Britain and France, they didn't want to hear this at all. Okay, one of the things that does at least happen to some degree are things like ethnic self-determination for certain colonies. So we're going to see Poland created, Czechoslovakia created, even though the Czechs and Slovaks are different people. We are going to see some of these places achieve self-determination, but nowhere near what needed to happen. Okay. But of all the points, the most important one to Wilson was the 14th point. And that would create something that would be kind of like the antecedent or the predecessor to today's United Nations. And so he called it a League of Nations to avoid future wars. And that was his most important one. That's more than anything of his 14 points. He thought this would be the kind of the capstone. This would be the thing that history would remember him by. And they do, but just not in the way probably he wanted them to. All right. So the big four, really by this time, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. So there they are. The big four, other than Wilson, kind of had other plans, and this is going to go a long way to hurt the Germans and to foster a kind of a sense of upset. Being upset, and that's going to lead to World War II. So instead of kind of like peace without victory, what happens is it was peace with punishment. And so the Germans were made to pay about $30 billion in war reparations for the damages that they inflicted upon the Allied powers. They were stripped of their colonies, right? And this is one of the reasons the Germans were fighting the wars, because they wanted to gain more colonies for natural resources for their industrial machine. They were stripped of their military and basically made by Britain and France to not build up their military. And so this is why it's such a big deal when Hitler does it. He's basically doing it, in the 1930s, and he's not supposed to be doing that. All right, and then we have a mandate system, and so places like Lebanon and Iraq and Syria and the old Ottoman Empire, they get taken over by Britain and France, and the borders that you see today, from basically the Sykes-Picot Treaty afterwards, creates this mandate system. And so like Israel's part of that. And but it's the same old thing. It's just now, instead of other places controlling them, now basically the British and the French control them. And so really all of the other 13 points, they don't really get accomplished. But the one that at least, the big four, the big three outside of Wilson agreed to are the League of Nations. But what's ironic about this is now Wilson has to get his own country to agree to it. And so now the battle kind of goes back to the United States. And here you can see, some of the places created from that. And then obviously this is going to look a little bit different once we get past World War II. It's going to change again. Okay, so Wilson now has the problem of getting the League of Nations passed at home. And the reason is because a stipulation of the 14th Amendment, 14th point, was that if war did break out again, that the United States would be committed to sending troops. And of course, that caused a big problem at home. And that's what Article 10 is. Article 10 of the League of Nations Charter said that, if there's some sort of issue, then it kind of binds us. So this is what we would call, if you guys remember in AP Human, a supranational organization. We are kind of bound. We lose a part of our sovereignty to do that. And there were a couple of groups of people in Congress that were just not going to hear that. And so probably the most extreme group were the irreconcilables. And, they just didn't want any part of a League of Nations. They didn't want any, fixing of it. They didn't want any changing of it. They just didn't want to be a part of it. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge, if we remember him, in the Spanish-American War, he was kind of one of those jingos. Well, now he wants to make sure that Congress has power over our troops. He doesn't want European powers to go to war and then make our troops go. And so he's part of the reservationists. So what he wants to do is he wants to rework Article 10 of the League of Nations so that it gives us more flexibility. But unfortunately, Wilson's not willing to hear it. He's the guy that created it. He doesn't want to compromise, and that's the problem. Now, furthering Wilson's problem is that in 1918, progressivism is basically coming to an end. We're starting to retreat into conservatism, and it shows in the off-year elections, where Republicans take control of Congress. And basically, this is going to thwart Wilson's plans. Okay, and a lot of people in New England, they're pretty ticked off because the income taxes hit them the most. They were the ones trying to trade during the war, and they don't want to pay for Wilson's war. All right, so ending up here, the failure for the League. Wilson tries to go on a whirlwind speaking tour going by train. I mean, he's, for an older person, he's going to like 30 different places in 20 days. And he ends up, ironically, in collapsing in Pueblo, Colorado, shortly after. Then he suffered a stroke. Now, Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge, even after Wilson is basically bedridden, they continue to fight over the 14 points, the Article 10 in Congress. But Wilson won't budge; he will not compromise on it. And so, even though Congress makes these changes, Wilson ends up voting it down. So, in a way, he kind of ends up voting down his own idea. And so, America, the country, the very country that came up with the 14 points plan, we end up not even joining it. We end up not even joining the League of Nations. And so, in a way, that's a huge failure, and it's a huge failure for the world because now we do not have an international body in place that's going to mediate. And I think hopefully, you can figure out where this is going. This is going to be a problem when we start getting to some of the things that caused World War II. Okay. All right. So that is it for World War I. Thank you for tuning in.